The dawn of another battle crept over the fields of Normandy, shrouded in a thick, damp fog that hung low over the hedgerows. The landscape was a shattered mosaic of craters, scorched trees, and broken farmhouses, silent witnesses to weeks of relentless combat. The ground was slick with rain and churned mud, deep tracks marking where tanks had fought and fallen. From beyond the horizon came the low, rhythmic thunder of approaching engines, the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Crawling through the haze came the American M4 Sherman tanks, their olive-drab hulls glistening with dew, tracks grinding through the soft, scarred earth. Some bore the white star insignia of the U.S. Army, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and soot. Others carried makeshift sandbags and welded metal plates, improvised armor added by crews desperate for a little more protection. Each Sherman was not just a machine of war, but a small world of its own, 5 men sealed inside a metal box, their lives depending on steel barely 2 inches thick. Inside the cramped interiors, the air was hot and suffocating. The smell of oil, cordite, and sweat mixed with the faint hum of the engine. The crew barely spoke, they didn't need to. The clatter of treads, the creak of suspension, and the occasional radio crackle filled the silence. Somewhere ahead lay German lines, and with them, the dreaded silhouettes of Panzer IVs and Panthers. Every soldier had heard the stories, how a single German tank could knock out a Sherman from over a kilometer away, while the Americans often had to get dangerously close just to score a hit. The tension was almost physical, a pressure in the chest, a cold weight in the stomach. The commander stood half exposed from the turret, scanning the fog through his binoculars. "Keep your eyes sharp," he muttered, voice barely audible over the engine's growl. "They're out there." In the distance, the rumble of artillery began to roll closer, followed by flashes on the horizon as the German guns had found their range. A few seconds later, explosions erupted across the fields, shaking the very earth beneath the tanks. Clouds of dirt and debris rained down, hammering the Sherman's armor. One crewman flinched as shrapnel clanged against the side of the hull, a metallic reminder that death could come at any second. Still, the column pushed on. The Sherman's engines strained as they climbed a muddy embankment, treads slipping for traction. The commander raised a hand and told the signal to halt. Through the lifting fog, dark shapes loomed in the hedgerows ahead. Were they trees or tanks? The Western Front was a battlefield unlike any other, a patchwork of open fields, thick bocage hedges, and narrow roads where visibility was measured in meters, not miles. It was terrain made for ambushes, where a single hidden Panzer could devastate an entire column before vanishing again. The Americans had learned that the hard way in the weeks following D-Day. And yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, the Shermans rolled forward not with arrogance, but with grim determination. Each man inside knew the risks. They knew the odds. But they also knew that their tank was mocked by the enemy as a Ronson, because it lit up the first time every time had something the Germans underestimated: numbers, mobility, and the spirit of the men who drove it. As the fog began to thin, the distant outlines of burning villages flickered against the pale morning light. The battlefield ahead awaited them, a crucible where steel, courage, and survival would decide who lived to see another dawn. Across the fields beyond the hedgerows, the true nightmare of every Sherman crew waited for the German Panzer divisions. These weren't just tanks, they were predators built for war. The Panzer IV, Panther, and the dreaded Tiger I, each one a masterpiece of German engineering, bristling with armor and armed with cannons that could pierce a Sherman from over a mile away. The thick, sloped armor of the Panther made it nearly invincible from the front, while the Tiger's 88mm gun was a weapon of pure terror. American crews often called their Shermans Ronsons after the lighter brand because when hit, they lit up the first time, every time. The nickname wasn't entirely unfair. The Sherman's gasoline engine and thin side armor made it frighteningly vulnerable. Many crews knew that if a Tiger spotted them first, their odds of survival dropped to near zero. German tank commanders, hidden in forest lines or camouflaged hull-down positions, would wait patiently. One shot, a flash of orange, and an American tank would erupt in flames, its turret blasted skyward by the force of detonation. But despite this imbalance, the Americans never stopped advancing. Intelligence reports spoke of entire Panzer battalions ambushing U.S. armored columns, yet the Shermans kept coming. For every Panther or Tiger the Germans deployed, the Allies sent 5 or 10 Shermans rolling forward. The German tanks were deadly, yes, but they were slow, expensive, and few in number. The battlefield was becoming a war of endurance, and the Shermans were about to prove that survival wasn't just about armor thickness, it was about adaptability, teamwork, and courage under fire. The first clash came at dawn, near the outskirts of a ruined French village, a place the locals once called Saint-Lô, now just smoldering rubble and broken church bells. The mist hung low as the American column of Shermans crept forward through narrow lanes lined with shattered stone walls. Then, from the tree line ahead, a thunderous crack split the silence. A Panther tank hidden behind the ruins of a barn fired first. The 75mm shell screamed across the field and slammed into the lead Sherman, tearing through its armor like paper. Flames burst from the turret as black smoke billowed skyward. The radio crackled with panic Tiger at 11 o'clock. Instantly, the surviving Shermans lurched into motion. Their engines roared as they tried to fan out, seeking cover behind what little remained of the buildings. The tank commanders shouted orders through the intercoms: load AP. Range 800 yards, as the gunners desperately tried to spot the enemy through fogged periscopes. Another shell whistled past, striking a nearby wall and sending debris clattering onto the tank's hull. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and cordite, every man knowing one hit could mean death. Then came the Americans' reply. A Sherman Firefly, the British modified variant armed with a deadly 17-pounder gun, lined up its shot. Its gunner, calm under fire, exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared, and the armor-piercing shell streaked across the open field. A second later, the Panther's turret erupted in flame, the explosion echoing across the countryside. The crew inside the Firefly cheered, relief washing over them for just a moment, but it wouldn't last long. Because the Germans were never alone. Another Tiger rolled out from behind the hedgerows, its massive silhouette cutting through the smoke. The ground seemed to tremble under its weight. The Sherman 75mm rounds bounced harmlessly off its thick frontal armor, sparks flying like fireworks. Every hit from the Tiger was a death sentence, and the Americans knew it. Still, they pressed on, using speed, maneuver, and sheer willpower to outflank the beast. Steel clashed against steel, fire against fire, and in that chaos, the Sherman crews learned something vital. They couldn't rely on brute strength to win. They would have to outthink, outmove, and outlast the enemy. By mid-1944, the American crews had learned a hard truth. The M4 Sherman wasn't built to outgun or outarmor the German Panzers. It was built to outfight them through speed, coordination, and cunning. The Allies had entered France expecting fast breakthroughs and open maneuver warfare. But what they found instead were ambushed German tanks lurking in hedgerows, waiting for the perfect shot. And so, the Sherman crews began to evolve. Tank commanders now treated every hedgerow and farmhouse like a potential trap. They advanced in bounding overwatch, one group covering while another moved, constantly communicating by radio. Spotters and half-tracks or jeeps would scan the ridgelines and tree lines for the telltale glint of a Panzer's gun barrel. Sherman platoons rarely moved alone anymore. They rolled with infantry, engineers, and air support in a combined arms ballet choreographed for survival. In the cramped interior of a Sherman, every man had a job that could mean life or death. The driver kept the tank angled toward likely threats to maximize the armor's sloping. The loader learned to swap shells with lightning speed, high explosive for infantry, armor-piercing for tanks, sometimes firing 3 rounds in under 20 seconds. The gunner, hunched over his sight, became a hunter. Hit and move, they were told. Never stay still after a shot. Because if a Panther spotted you, it was already too late. The Americans began using smoke rounds to blind German gunners and artillery spotting planes to call in strikes on entrenched positions. At night, Shermans moved quietly, their engines throttled low, taking new routes to surprise German defenses at dawn. They even used the terrain itself as a weapon, cresting hills just enough for their guns to peek over before firing, then slipping back behind cover. And slowly, painfully, it started to work. Shermans that once burned in open fields now moved like ghosts unseen until their cannons spoke. The crews learned to read the battlefield the way hunters read tracks in the mud. They were no longer just tankers, they were survivors. But adaptation alone wasn't enough. The Germans still had superior firepower, and every encounter could turn fatal in an instant. The Americans needed something more, something that could change the odds when steel alone couldn't. The Americans knew they couldn't keep sending their crews into duels where the first hit meant death. The Sherman needed to evolve, and fast. Across the Channel, British engineers had already begun experimenting with something bold. They took the humble M4 chassis and armed it with one of the most powerful Allied guns of the war, the 17-pounder. The result was the Sherman Firefly, a machine that could finally stare down a Panther and fire back with lethal confidence. Its long barrel stretched out like a spear, often mistaken for a German gun from a distance. When it fired, the 17-pounder's crack shattered the air, and even the formidable Tiger could be destroyed with a well-placed shot. Crews painted the end of the barrel with camouflage stripes to make it appear shorter, a clever deception to buy them a few more seconds in battle. For many Allied tankers, the Firefly was a psychological victory as much as a tactical one. For the first time, they could fight the Germans on equal terms. But the Americans had their own solution, taking the shape of the M4A3E8, affectionately nicknamed the EZ-8. Equipped with a 76mm high-velocity gun, improved horizontal volute suspension, and wider tracks, it was smoother, faster, and more stable over rough terrain. The EZ-8 could hit targets at greater ranges and withstand hits that would have crippled earlier Shermans. Its armor was slightly thicker and better sloped, giving it a fighting chance against the fearsome German 75mm and 88mm shells. In the workshops behind the front lines, mechanics worked day and night welding, rearming, and upgrading Shermans under floodlights that glared like miniature suns. Crews painted names on the sides of their tanks: Hell's Fury, Lucky Lady, Old Ironsides, each name carrying the weight of hope and superstition. When these new Shermans rolled out of the depots, their crews felt something different: confidence. By late 1944, platoons were a mix of standard M4s, Fireflies, and EZ-8s, creating a deadly combination of mobility, firepower, and versatility. In the chaos of the Ardennes, the EZ-8s proved their worth, maneuvering through snow and mud to outflank German armor. When a Firefly's shot tore through a Tiger's frontal plate, word spread like wildfire the tide was turning. Yet even as technology improved, the true edge lay not in the metal but in the men who commanded it, the tacticians, the gunners, and the brave souls who learned to fight smarter with every battle. And as winter descended over Europe, those lessons would be tested in fire and snow during one of the most brutal confrontations of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. The winter of 1944 descended on Europe like a merciless shroud. The Ardennes forest, once lush and green, was now a frozen labyrinth of snow-laden pines and silent death. Temperatures plunged below freezing, muffling the world in a deceptive calm. Then, without warning, the horizon erupted. German artillery shells screamed through the mist, exploding among American columns. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Caught off guard, Sherman crews scrambled to their tanks, breath steaming in the frigid air. Engines coughed to life reluctantly, thick black smoke curling skyward. Snow clung to their uniforms as they loaded ammunition and slammed hatches shut. The radios crackled with frantic messages. Panzer units spotted near Bastogne. Hold your position. Across the white expanse, Tiger and Panther tanks advanced with grim precision, their dark silhouettes almost ghostly against the snow. For the Sherman crews, survival now meant ingenuity. They knew that in a head-on fight, they'd stand little chance, but they had learned from months of brutal combat. Using the thick forest for cover, they maneuvered like hunters instead of prey. Each Sherman moved in coordination, one drawing fire while others flanked. When the Germans fired, muzzle flashes gave away their positions, and within seconds, American guns roared back in unison. The snow amplified every sound, the screech of metal on metal, the thunder of cannons, and the sickening hiss of rounds piercing steel. Shells exploded in geysers of snow and dirt, blanketing the tanks in white dust. Inside, crews worked in near darkness, relying on instinct and experience. Loader, gunner, commander, every man knew his role, every second mattered. Fuel lines froze, engines stalled, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Yet the Shermans pressed on, weaving between trees and shattered vehicles. When the fog lifted briefly, the sight was haunting. Burning hulks of tanks, both Allied and German, dotted the landscape, their flames flickering like torches in the frozen twilight. But amid the wreckage, the Shermans' persistence stood out. Despite being outgunned and outmatched, They refused to die. One American crew near Foy managed to knock out 3 Panthers using a daring ambush from a snow-covered ridge. They waited in silence, hearts pounding, until the first German tank crossed into view. The gunner exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the Sherman 76mm shell tore through the Panther's side armor, erupting it in flames. 2 more shots followed, and by the time the smoke cleared, the ridge belonged to the Americans. The winter raged on, but so did their spirit. The Shermans became not just machines of war, they were symbols of endurance, of men who refused to break even when the odds turned impossible. As one tanker wrote home from the Ardennes, "The cold bites, the shells fall, and still we move forward." By the time the snow began to melt, the German advance had been broken. The battered Shermans rolled on, scarred but unyielding, carrying their crews toward the final push into the heart of Germany itself. In the chaos of the Western Front, sheer firepower alone could not guarantee survival. The Sherman crews quickly realized that the tank was only as strong as the minds and coordination behind it. Amid the smoke, mud, and steel, teamwork became their greatest weapon. Commanders shouted into radios and across turret hatches, coordinating movements that would turn vulnerability into advantage. Each Sherman was part of a living, breathing unit, not an isolated machine. Convoys moved in staggered formations to reduce exposure, using hedgerows, destroyed buildings, and natural ridges as temporary shields against German 75mm and 88mm cannons. When one Sherman drew enemy fire, another flanked from an unexpected angle, catching the Panther or Tiger off guard. Engineers and scouts scouted ahead, marking minefields and obstacles, while artillery observers relayed coordinates back to support units. The battlefield became a chessboard, and the Shermans moved with careful, calculated precision. Innovation was equally vital. Crews modified their tanks in small but effective ways, adding sandbags, logs, and spare track pieces to bolster side armor, sometimes welding extra plating to vulnerable sections. Gun crews experimented with angled shots, exploiting weak spots in German armor. Drivers learned to dance the tanks advancing, backing up, pivoting, forcing enemy gunners to constantly recalibrate. Every movement was a lesson in physics and psychology. Inside the tanks, coordination reached almost instinctual levels. The loader anticipated the commander's commands, the gunner adjusted aim based on engine vibrations and terrain, and the driver executed maneuvers with split-second precision. When a shell struck nearby, the crew knew exactly which hatch to brace, which angle to shift, and when to return fire. It was an intricate ballet of life and death, choreographed under immense pressure. Beyond mechanical ingenuity, Shermans thrived on human strategy. Crews communicated silently with hand signals and subtle turret adjustments, often exchanging glances that conveyed complex tactical decisions without a word. They set ambush points along narrow roads, drawing panzers into kill zones pre-planned with reconnaissance teams. Smoke screens, dummy targets, and terrain manipulation became standard tools, converting the Shermans' perceived weaknesses into surprising strengths. By mid-1944, German tank commanders began to take notice. What they had assumed would be an easy kill, slow-firing, lightly armored Shermans now required careful coordination, patience, and sometimes luck to even damage. The Americans had turned survival into an art form, blending technology, teamwork, and sheer creativity in a way that defied expectations. As one tanker recalled during a lull in the fighting near St. Lo, "We weren't the biggest or the strongest, but we were smart. Every shell we dodged, every flank we executed, was a victory before the shot was even fired." In the fields of France, innovation and teamwork were no longer optional. They were the difference between life and death. The sight of a German Tiger tank emerging from behind a crumbling farmhouse or along a sunken lane could stop a Sherman crew's heart for a moment, but hesitation was a luxury they could not afford. These encounters were high-stakes, high-adrenaline confrontations where every decision, every second, could mean survival or annihilation. The Tiger, with its thick armor and devastating 88mm gun, was a nightmare in steel form, but the Sherman crews had learned to adapt. As the Tiger advanced, Sherman gunners would scan relentlessly for weak points, side armor near the tracks, rear panels, and hatches. The driver would twist and pivot the hull, using the muddy terrain, hedgerows, and shell craters as improvised cover. Smoke, dust, and debris kicked up by prior bombardments often served as camouflage, allowing Shermans to maneuver into flanking positions. Unlike open-field tank battles where the Tiger could dominate, close encounters forced German crews to react, giving Shermans a fighting chance. Coordination between multiple Sherman units became critical. One tank would engage directly, drawing the Tiger's attention, while others moved laterally or behind it, seeking angles that could exploit its slower turret traverse. Crews employed hit-and-run tactics, firing from unexpected positions, then ducking behind hedgerows or wreckage to reload and reassess. In several documented instances, groups of 3 to 4 Shermans working together were able to disable or destroy a Tiger that would have crushed a lone Sherman. The psychological aspect of these encounters was immense. The Tiger's reputation alone intimidated many inexperienced crews, but those who understood its limitations, long reload times, sluggish maneuvering, and restricted visibility turned fear into tactical advantage. Observers often reported rapid, almost dance-like movements of Shermans in forests, towns, and narrow roads, darting from cover to cover while the Tiger struggled to acquire targets. Inside the tanks, the crews moved as one unit. The gunners tracked the Tiger's movement while the loader kept rounds ready, and the driver anticipated each turn to avoid exposing the side armor. Communication through hatches, hand signals, and radios ensured split-second coordination, often outmatching the slower, more rigid German command structures. Even minor innovations mattered. Extra track segments or sandbags angled along vulnerable sections sometimes caused Tiger shells to glance off, while calculated retreats into depressions or behind destroyed buildings could absorb or deflect shots. These small, improvisational measures, combined with precision teamwork, allowed Shermans to survive encounters that would seem impossible on paper. By late 1944, tales of small Sherman units ambushing Tigers circulated widely. German crews were forced to respect the ingenuity and resilience of these so-called easy kills. What they hadn't anticipated was the human element, clever tactics, coordination, and courage turning an underpowered tank into a lethal and survivable weapon against even the most formidable armor. The clash of steel and strategy at close quarters was a testament to adaptation and grit, proving that numbers, coordination, and quick thinking could triumph over raw firepower. The battlefield after a tank engagement was a chaotic landscape of twisted metal, scorched earth, and lingering smoke, but amidst this devastation, the American M4 Shermans showcased a remarkable resilience that both surprised and frustrated German forces. A Sherman hit by an 88mm Panzer shell didn't always explode or ignite. Instead, many crews found themselves trapped inside tanks that were dented, scorched, or partially disabled, yet still operational enough to retreat, reposition, or even continue fighting. Mechanics at the front and clever crews had developed improvisational methods to keep their tanks moving despite severe damage. Track segments were repaired in the field with hand tools, hatches were welded or propped to keep internal systems intact, and jury-rigged electrical connections allowed radios and targeting systems to function despite shell shocks. Some tanks emerged from engagements with blasted fenders, turret dents, and spent shell fragments embedded in armor, yet the crew inside adapted, using skill, experience, and sheer determination to navigate the battlefield. The Sherman's relatively simple mechanical design was crucial in these situations. Unlike the heavy, complex Tiger tanks that could be disabled by a single critical hit, Shermans had modular engines and suspension systems that could absorb damage and still operate. Crews learned to exploit these features, keeping their tank moving even if the gun or tracks were partially compromised. Field improvisation became second nature. Sandbags, steel plates, and even spare track links were attached to vulnerable areas, sometimes deflecting subsequent shots. Inside the tank, the atmosphere was tense but coordinated. The driver adjusted speed and angle to avoid further hits, the gunner aimed with meticulous care despite recoil-altered optics, and the commander constantly assessed the surrounding terrain for cover and escape routes. Crews became adept at reading the battlefield, anticipating German fire, exploiting blind spots, and ensuring that even damaged Shermans could contribute to suppressive fire or strategic maneuvers. Observers on the front lines noted that this resilience had a profound psychological impact. German soldiers, expecting a single well-placed shot to destroy a Sherman outright, were often frustrated when the tank kept returning fire or retreating under control. These indestructible Shermans forced Germans to expend additional ammunition, rethink attack strategies, and sometimes abandon positions altogether. Learning from each encounter, crews shared battlefield knowledge through debriefings, passing tips on how to minimize vulnerability, repair under fire, and coordinate damaged units. Each engagement turned the Sherman into a classroom of survival, proving that durability, coupled with human ingenuity, often mattered more than armor thickness alone. The image of a Sherman battered and scorched but still advancing across Normandy's shattered countryside became a symbol of American adaptability and tenacity, a tank that refused to die, and a crew that refused to surrender. This hard-earned survivability set the stage for daring maneuvers, flanking attacks, and coordinated assaults that would define late 1944 armored warfare. The Normandy fields echoed with a low rumble of advancing tanks as Sherman crews learned firsthand how their armor could turn the tide of an encounter with German Panzers. The early morning haze revealed the silhouettes of enemy Tigers and Panthers, their 75mm and 88mm cannons trained with deadly precision. A German shell screamed through the air, striking the frontal glacis of a Sherman, and instead of catastrophic destruction, sparks flew and the shell ricocheted off at an angle, embedding fragments into the mud. The crew inside jolted but remained unharmed, their adrenaline surging as they realized their steel hulls were designed not just to endure, but to deflect. The M4 Sherman's armor, though thinner than the Germans' heavy tanks, was angled strategically on the hull and turret, increasing the likelihood of shells glancing off rather than penetrating. Crews quickly learned to maneuver their tanks to maximize this advantage, presenting slopes and angles to enemy fire while advancing or retreating. The result was a deadly game of geometry. A slight tilt or adjustment of the hull could mean the difference between a glancing blow and total destruction. Even when hit directly, the armor's layered construction combining rolled homogeneous steel with spaced plating often prevented catastrophic interior damage. Crews observed shell impacts leaving dramatic dents, twisted panels, and scorch marks on the outside, yet the interior systems, engine, and ammunition compartments remained surprisingly intact. Tankers began to trust that their machines could absorb punishment, enabling bolder maneuvers and more aggressive fire-and-move tactics under enemy fire. Field reports and after-action sketches from Sherman crews reveal patterns. Shots aimed at the lower glacis frequently failed to penetrate because of hull angle and mud-splatter deflection, while turret hits sometimes left the gun operational despite visible cosmetic damage. Observers on both sides began to recognize a disorienting phenomenon. The Sherman seemed to shrug off hits that would immobilize other tanks, giving American armored units a psychological edge in engagements. Meanwhile, German tank crews became increasingly frustrated. Their targeting charts and calculated trajectories, honed for early engagements, were proving ineffective. Shells that were expected to annihilate American tanks instead glanced harmlessly, ricocheting into nearby earth or exploding in harmless airbursts. This mismatch forced German commanders to allocate more shots per target, slowing their advance and giving Shermans the opportunity to flank, retreat, or concentrate fire on vulnerable points. From inside, the Sherman crew felt a mix of relief and empowerment. The driver adjusted tracks for maximum stability on muddy terrain, the gunner maintained a steady aim while the turret absorbed minor impacts, and the commander coordinated with nearby tanks to exploit enemy vulnerabilities. Every successful deflection built confidence, and each encounter added to the Sherman's growing legend as a tank that could survive hits once considered fatal, changing the dynamics of armored warfare on the Western Front. This ability to withstand Panzer fire not only saved countless crews but also laid the groundwork for the Sherman's reputation as a versatile, durable, and surprisingly resilient tank, capable of turning defensive pressure into offensive opportunity. The battlefield spectacle of sparks flying off armor, shells ricocheting harmlessly, and Shermans pressing forward became an enduring image of American ingenuity meeting the harsh realities of European armored combat. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of smoke, mud, and shattered steel as Sherman crews faced the relentless onslaught of German Panzer fire. Yet, amid the chaos, the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the men inside these tanks became as vital a weapon as the M4's 75mm gun. When a shell struck a Sherman's track or damaged its suspension, the crew didn't wait for the battle to end. They acted immediately, improvising repairs with whatever tools and materials were at hand. The driver would coordinate with a loader and gunner to stabilize the vehicle, while the commander directed men to patch holes or replace track links as quickly as possible. Outside, under intermittent fire, tank crew members could be seen wrestling with heavy steel links, their faces smeared with grease and sweat, every movement calculated to restore mobility before the enemy could exploit the damage. The thick smoke and dust provided partial cover, but the ever-present threat of a follow-up Panzer shell created a tense urgency. Each successful repair, whether a reconnected track, a realigned wheel, or a patched hull, was celebrated quietly with nods and clenched fists, small victories that kept the tank moving and the mission alive. Field manuals and veteran accounts detail how crews adapted standard procedures to battlefield emergencies. Improvised levers, hammers, and even bayonets were employed to clear jams, tighten bolts, or realign turret mechanisms. Engine compartments were checked on the fly, belts adjusted, and ammunition racks secured, all while under the looming threat of enemy fire. This resourcefulness transformed the Sherman from a mere machine into a mobile fortress, capable of surviving and returning to the fight despite sustaining substantial damage. Psychologically, these rapid repairs bolstered morale. The crew's confidence in their ability to keep the Sherman operational meant that even when German shells impacted armor, the tank didn't automatically retreat. Instead, it pressed forward, often surprising German commanders who expected immobilization. Tales from Normandy and the Ardennes recount tanks rolling away from direct hits only to surge back into action after quick, clever fixes, a testament to human ingenuity complementing mechanical resilience. This culture of quick thinking and adaptability extended beyond individual Shermans. Units developed coordinated support systems, with nearby tanks carrying spare track links, tools, and even parts to assist comrades. Crews learned to communicate silently with hand signals or subtle turret movements to indicate repair needs, turning every Sherman into a collaborative hub of armored problem-solving. The combination of crew skill, ingenuity, and Sherman design meant that damage rarely equaled defeat, and that resilience under fire became a defining hallmark of American armored warfare. The morning mist over the Normandy hedgerows was pierced by the synchronized rumble of multiple Sherman tanks advancing in formation, their tracks churning mud and splintered earth beneath. From a distance, the battlefield seemed like a living chessboard, each M4 moving with precision, coordinated by seasoned commanders who had learned the hard lessons of tank warfare. The Panzers lurking in hidden positions were about to face not just individual machines, but a well-coordinated interlocking system of firepower that had evolved to exploit every Sherman's strengths. Through the thick smoke of previous engagements, Shermans would alternate firing, covering each other while maneuvering across open fields and crumbling roads. Gunners leaned over sights, eyes scanning the hedgerows for flashes of enemy armor, while commanders communicated silently with hand signals or radio bursts, orchestrating volleys with military choreography. Artillery support and infantry presence interwove seamlessly, creating overlapping zones of suppression that limited German tactical options. Every Sherman 75mm cannon was more than a weapon, it was a node in a network. While one tank engaged a Panther from the flank, another would cover advancing infantry, and a third would maneuver into a firing position to exploit weak points in German lines. Smoke and dust created dramatic streaks across the battlefield, blurring the distance between tanks while emphasizing the coordinated fluidity of movement. Sparks flew as rounds struck hedgerows, and the occasional ricochet off a Panzer's armor sent shivers through nearby crews, yet the formation held, a testament to disciplined strategy and mutual trust. Historical accounts from Normandy describe how Sherman platoons would alternate attacks, using overlapping arcs of fire to saturate German positions. Even when a tank was damaged or immobilized, nearby Shermans would adjust their positions, covering the disabled vehicle while it underwent on-the-spot repairs. This constant rotation of fire and movement created psychological pressure on German crews, who found themselves unable to concentrate fire on any single target without being exposed to return shots. The synergy extended to coordination with infantry units. Riflemen and machine gunners would advance alongside the rolling Shermans, taking advantage of the suppression fire and open lanes created by the tanks. Engineers followed close behind, clearing obstacles and mines, ensuring the armored advance remained fluid. This multi-layered integration made the Sherman formation more than just an aggregation of tanks. It was a mobile, adaptive fighting force capable of sustaining itself under intense enemy fire while delivering devastating counterattacks. By the time the smoke cleared over the Normandy countryside, the visible impact of Sherman coordinated fire was unmistakable. German defensive positions disrupted, Panzers forced into retreat or destruction, and American forces pressing forward with confidence. It was in these orchestrated maneuvers that the Sherman truly proved its worth, demonstrating that resilience was not only in armor or mechanical design, but in how crews, units, and supporting forces fought together as a single lethal entity. As the smoke of battle slowly lifted over the scarred fields of Normandy, the shattered landscape revealed more than just the cost of war. It told a story of adaptation, resilience, and tactical ingenuity. Sherman tanks, battered and scarred, still stood where lesser vehicles would have been abandoned, their crews emerging with a mix of exhaustion and triumph etched across dirt-smeared faces. Analysts and commanders surveyed the terrain, taking note of every dent, every shell mark, every scorched hedgerow, piecing together lessons from the day's fierce engagements. Detailed diagrams were sketched in the mud, illustrating where Panzer IV and Tiger I rounds had impacted Sherman armor and how the rounds had either been deflected or absorbed. Engineers and tank specialists noted the effectiveness of sloped armor, the ingenuity of on-field repairs, and the role of coordinated unit tactics in offsetting the Sherman's perceived vulnerabilities. The tanks had not only survived, they had demonstrated that mechanical strength, crew skill, and tactical coordination together could overcome superior enemy firepower. Veteran accounts highlighted how Sherman's mobility allowed crews to avoid concentrated enemy fire, reposition rapidly, and maintain offensive momentum even when facing heavier German tanks. Infantry liaison officers noted that supporting soldiers felt far more secure operating alongside Sherman units, confident in the tank's ability to absorb hits that would have otherwise been catastrophic. This interplay of mechanical design and human strategy became the cornerstone of the Sherman's battlefield legacy. Historians later emphasized that the Sherman did more than just survive. It redefined armored warfare. It was no longer just the gun or armor thickness that determined battlefield dominance. It was adaptability, logistical efficiency, crew training, and integrated tactics. Reports compiled after the engagements demonstrated how even when outgunned or out-armored, Sherman crews could maximize their strengths and exploit enemy weaknesses, turning what critics once called a medium tank with mediocre firepower into a symbol of American armored resilience. Maps, overlay graphics, and archival footage would later illustrate how Sherman platoons had systematically neutralized German positions, using speed, maneuverability, and coordinated fire to disrupt Panther and Tiger formations. Strategic observers recognized that the lessons learned in Normandy would influence armored doctrine for decades. Speed, versatility, and teamwork mattered as much as steel and shells. As sunlight filtered through the tattered hedgerows and smoke slowly dispersed into the morning sky, the enduring image of the Sherman emerged, scarred but undefeated, a testament to the combination of human courage, technological ingenuity, and tactical mastery. The Western Front had proven that in war, survival was about more than raw power. It was about knowing how to fight smart, work together, and adapt under fire. Sherman's story became not just one of machines, but of the men and strategies that made it an icon of resilience and ingenuity in armored warfare.